So, welcome everyone. We're honored to have Tim and Allen's work here. We sort of independently chose to show the work, and then we found, there's a lot of relationships between the two. So, most of you know these two, but just a little background. Tim's a writer, photographer. In 2016, he had a book, In and Out of Context, that was published of his photographs, and there was an exhibition at the Art Institute that went with that. And in our first show, this is just our second exhibit, really. We had a couple of larger scale photographs of Tim's than the ones that are here right now. And Allen, among the other things he does, he's a filmmaker, and that's how I got acquainted with him. And he's the curator of the Solvency Cinema series, which is a very interesting film series that's had, I think, 3 presentations so far. And basically the imagery and the photographs have a relationship to each other, so we thought it'd be a good idea to have the two of them just have a little conversation amongst themselves. So, welcome. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I had the good luck to see Joe's film before I plotted what I would show here, so we were able to set up some correspondences and divergences too. But I think Alan can talk about his film.
Yeah, so the film, it's an installation and it runs on a loop, so you can walk in at any moment and watch it through. And it's designed kind of to work in a non-linear fashion so that it doesn't just go from A to Z. It's continuous and infinite. And that sense of the infinite relates to the title, which is Permanent State of Exception. Permanent State of Exception is a quote from the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, and it's in relationship to this idea that you have all of these forces, socio-political forces, that have so much power that there are times in which they can choose to suspend the normal rule of ethics and create a permanent state of exception to those rules. And that essentially leads to tyranny or totalitarian existence. So the film is kind of an abstract exploration or meditation on those notions, but also on how that relates to the human condition. And it was shot on black and white Super 8 film. So it was shot on a medium that we know from the past, capturing images from the present to contemplate a potential future. And it, in my mind, it leaves open the question of what that future might be. It could be joyous, it could be ominous, it could be beautiful, it could be calamitous, depending on how we go as a species and as culture evolves or doesn't. And so it was shot over 4 years in Minnesota, Minneapolis, and Duluth, as well as Pittsburgh, rural Wisconsin, and the North Shore. And it was a slow process of having a camera with me and gathering images as they came to me, if they felt to me in that moment intuitively like they would fit this piece. And there's also a sound collage. The sound elements are taken from radio broadcasts over the last 100 years. And there are just little snippets that talk about various cultural or socio-political things happening at different times. Because I wanted the film to feel, in a sense, like something that you would stumble upon, that was obviously contemporary. You see images of of fire trucks and bicycles and cars and things that read as contemporary, but that it felt like it could have come out of time. And so the radio broadcast from the last century kind of hinted that. And then I commissioned a score by Andy McCormick, who's part of a band in Minneapolis called Dreamland Faces. And they're known for doing silent film scores, and they'll kind of write them and play them live. So they've done scores to Buster Keaton films, Charlie Chaplin films, Harold Lloyd films, and things like that. And I approached Andy about making something for this. I gave him a few ideas and notes, and then gave him sort of the background and let him craft something. And he would record parts and send them to me, and then I would give him some more ideas or notes, and then he sent me kind of the finished piece, and then I recut a few things to sort of suit that to make the final work. And then it was installed here, and then Tim had kind of looked at it and taken it in and saw what resonated there with his work and put together his installation. I don't know if you want to talk more about that process.
Yeah, I mentioned before that I saw sort of a Candide-like aspect to Allen's film. There's a sequence of a woman in a garden with a teacup, and it seemed to me about carving out an idyllic space that's ever narrowing, and I work from that point of view a lot in my own work. Trying to pull things from the chaos, and what I've shown are sort of leveling influences, easily apprehended, things that are very close at hand. A skirt, a view out the window, literally what's right at your feet. And my goal is to abject the chaos and to focus on those idyllic moments. Where Allen's makes me profoundly anxious. The score in particular, and the fire trucks, and the strobing. So we come from a similar place, but different approaches.
Right. Yeah. It was interesting because I hadn't thought of Candide or Voltaire consciously when I was making the work, but when Tim pointed out that connection, it seemed really true to the piece, because you have all of these images from life, all of these documentary images of buildings burning down in hailstorms, in rain that I captured as they happened. And then you also have staged images of a woman drinking tea in this kind of burnt out garden where you see rubble from a building and plants growing all around the rubble. So it's sort of a hybrid film. It's part documentary and part, I don't want to say narrative, but part non-documentary. And those images do kind of stand out amongst the rubble of the rest. And in Candide, Voltaire writes about how Candide is grappling with the chaos of life and ultimately decides, okay, in order to function in this world, I have to find and cultivate spaces of beauty. And so
Exactly.
Candide creates a garden and says we must each cultivate our own garden, which doesn't mean that it has to be a literal garden. It means you must cultivate a space within your life or within your mind that pays attention to those little beautiful moments in life. And I was thinking about that and the connection between Tim's work and my own, and I started thinking about human evolution, and I came across this quote from the biologist Richard Dawkins that I think it really reminded me of Tim's work and a little bit of what I'm doing in my installation. So I'd like to read this for you. There is an anesthetic of familiarity, a sedative of ordinariness, which dulls our senses and hides the wonder of existence. For those of us not gifted in poetry, it is worthwhile from time to time making an effort to shake off this anesthetic. What is the best way of countering the sluggish habituation brought about by our gradual crawl from babyhood? Though we cannot actually fly to another planet, we can choose to recapture a sense of having just tumbled out to life on a new world by looking more closely at our own. And I think that's kind of what Tim's work does. It's focusing in on these moments that may be surrounded by chaos and choosing to find something in those that opens us to the wonder of life, often in spite of its sometimes vulgar barbarity.
Sweet.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was thinking about is Albert Camus' myth of Sisyphus. So he talks about this idea of Sisyphus, who's this character in mythology rolling a rock up a hill continuously. It gets to this point and then it rolls back down. And Sisyphus has to crawl back down and push the rock up again and again. And Camus says that we have to imagine that Sisyphus has found a way to create happiness and joy, even in the context of this futility. And I think there's some of that in my film as well. There's an image of someone mowing this lawn, and you just see this large expanse of green, and this tiny figure traversing the space, and you get this sense that it's, in a way, futile, but yet maybe joyous even in that futility. And the same with the woman who's drinking tea and kind of creating this sense of space and ritual among the rubble of life. So I don't know if you see those parallels in our stuff.
Oh, I identified strongly with the guy mowing the lawn. My life is navigating hellscapes on a daily basis, and this is my sedative. This is my calm place within that. So yeah.
Right. I'm kind of interested in more in the story of how you came to photography from painting.
By
And what
force, yeah, I was a painter, as I've told a lot of people before. Kind of mediocre figure studies, landscapes, and commercial painter to pay the bills. So 20 years of that, and I'd huffed so many solvents that I couldn't do my occupation or my medium, my art form anymore. And I spent about 5 or 6 years mute, just voiceless. I had nothing to express. And I went to the Workforce Center down in Minneapolis, and they figured I had a little acumen and a little college that they would send me to trade school. And I got into a photo program at MCTC in Minneapolis and just sort of ran with it when I found digital, a medium I didn't have to use chemicals and something I could carry around in my pocket and just grab things spontaneously. Things just lit. And that was about 7 years ago. And I enjoy this medium far more than I ever did as a painter.
Yeah.
You sit in a garret, you're huffing fumes and doing the whole tormented artist thing. But photography made me engage the world, my partners, my environment. Made me a lot more gregarious, which I never was, extroverted. And it was a gift to find it. So I'm still wrestling with digital as a form. It can be so clinical, so precise. The colors are sort of plastic. And I do mediate my images to kind of intervene on that. But I'm even getting worried about whether that's truthful or not. So these represent some newer works where the mediation is turned down and the thing itself is put forward. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a similar beginning, so to speak. I started off, I was living in a small town, northern town, studying painting and graphic arts. And I was really, at the time I was interested, I really liked Edward Hopper and Artemisia Gentileschi, two very different painters. I liked both of their stuff. Edward Hopper had this sense of capturing these kind of quotidian moments of life and light, and Artemisia had this sense of the social and the political. And I don't know if I was conscious of it at the time, but I think I was trying to find something that had elements of both of those. And the last painting I ever did was a painting of O.J. Simpson. It was an oil portrait. And then I saw a film by Andy Warhol, and so this light went off, and I thought, okay, I think film is my medium, and I've kind of been with it ever since. Incidentally, that painting is hanging in our hallway, and I've had this ongoing debate with my wife, who does not believe that I painted it, because she's never seen me do painting. And I destroyed all my other paintings. I had about a series of other oil paintings at the time, and I ripped them to shreds and destroyed them. I have this thing where I felt like I had to draw this distinction between what I had done, which was not much, but where I really wanted to go. And the interesting thing about seeing the Warhol film was that it introduced me to this avant-garde cinema, and it seemed very immediate and direct, almost primeval in a way, less concerned with perfection or overly wrought technical acumen. And he obviously had a sense of the technical and the tools he was using, but he was employing them in a more, almost an outsider fashion. And that really appealed to me, that you could make cinema coming from that perspective.
Which film do you remember?
It would have been one of the screen tests, but
Yeah.
though I don't remember specifically which one.
Not Empire.
No, it wasn't Empire, which is, what, 24-hour film? No. I later discovered that. But, and then just seeing that film led me to other people, Maya Deren and Nathaniel Dorsky and Stan Brakhage and Tarkovsky, Andrei Tarkovsky, the great Russian film artist. And I don't know that my work is anything like those artists, but that was a starting point for sending me on this journey away from what I had known in painting and visual arts and embracing filmmaking in a sort of fine arts context.
Do you have an urge at all to do still?
Well, I do still photography, and some of my films actually, because I shoot on Super 8, I shoot on digital video. I've shot this stuff called 35mm Lomo Kino, which is similar to Super 8.
And when you're rendering, you can see those.
Yeah.
Static.
And I also, some of my films have contained a mix of all of these things, including Polaroids, instant film, and 35mm stills. So I do shoot those, but they usually end up in a film rather than photos onto their own. There is that element to it. I think, what I think is distinctive about cinema from the other, people always say editing is what makes film unique, that you have this juxtaposition of shots. And I actually think what makes it unique is not that, because you can have juxtaposition in a graphic novel or in a photo book. In film, you've got movement or lack thereof within a frame, and that's what makes it unique from all the other art forms. Photography suggests it, but it doesn't show it in the way that film does. Film captures duration or the movement of time. Tarkovsky called it sculpting with time. And that is what is most intriguing to me about it. And that's something one thing you might notice in this installation, Permanent State of Exception, is that although it's handheld, there are no moving shots. There are no tracking shots following an object. Everything is static. And so if there's movement, which there is, it's within the frame. The camera itself doesn't move. And I think Godard said that the decision to move the camera following an object is actually an ethical and moral decision. And if you're going to do it, you must have a reason, and it must say something about the aesthetic. If you're not going to do it, it's the same thing. And for this work, I never felt compelled to move the camera. I wanted whatever movement there was to be within the frame, and it was playing with that. So it was very filmic, if you will. Do you ever have a compulsion to create moving images?
I mean, I've been approached for videos and such, and to art direct a few projects, but there's something about a static image that shows a deliberate choice. I mean, especially with framing and mounting, that this is my deliberate state. And that's where a still image reads more poetically for me than a film, though I'm moved ecstatically by film. I just prefer to say that this is where I will place my point of view. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something about that frozen moment that's more compelling in a way.
And the philosophy that everything you shoot is deceased the moment you make it. We see pictures from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and all those figures are gone. I was looking through Winogrand up at the Tweed yesterday, and all these beautiful poof. So I try to be filmic in the visuals that I put forward, but I'm aware of that dissolution of what I've caught. There's that phrase that you take a picture.
Right.
Where I get more from giving a picture than, I'm not collecting butterflies and making all these moments so that I can hold them. I place them, let them go, and give them to reception as opposed to whatever I'm trying to pronounce. I mean, I know what these things mean to me, but what's more important to me is what they mean to the people who view them.
Right.
And that's similar in your work too. It's given at a certain point.
Right, yeah. I was thinking earlier.
People come in and say Voltaire.
Voltaire, right. And then it goes in its own direction. And before the talk, I was thinking about the sense that we're both doing contemporary work, but I think there's
an ahistorical element.
A historical element to it, almost a timelessness in the way, the way you frame things and what you choose to capture. You can see that it's contemporary, but it doesn't feel overtly so. That's just sort of under the surface.
Mm.
And I think my work, my approach is somewhat similar. It's more intuitive. I don't know that I've ever sat down and said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this contemporary work, but it's not going to feel contemporary because I'm going to choose to capture things and not capture other things. But that does seem to have emerged from it. And people have told me that, and when I look at it, that seems true to me. But I was also thinking about, there's this French film theorist named André Bazin, who noted that all the arts have their origin in death rituals. So some of the early cave paintings seem to be related to rituals to prolong life against death. And then he draws parallels between that and indigenous cultures who would create little dolls that actually were meant to capture the essence of a person dying and preserve that essence. And then the Egyptians would do this with little sculptures of the pharaohs that were placed in the pyramids. And eventually, as art evolved, the first form that could do that more truly than anything else was photography, where it was embalming life and kind of rescuing it from oblivion. And then film was embalming time in life and rescuing that from oblivion. So there's an interesting parallel between our human early grappling with death and where we've come in terms of photography and film. And I think more than, say, painting or collage or other forms, both film and photography have a strong parallel to those early human impulses.
But then again, that lake will antecede all of us, and apples or garments will be here long after we are.
Yeah.
Ideally. I wonder about that impulse of the Lascaux painters. The first person to put their hand to a wall and blue pigment over it. And it is a progression. I don't think a linear one.
No.
Or that we're getting anywhere better than where that came from, but yeah.
It's just an inherent progression. It's just what happened. There's no ethical or moral value to one or the other against one or the other, but it is an interesting chronology of human development in the arts and culturally and where we are now. In a sense, it's ultimately futile. Everything kind of turns to dust, and someday the sun will obliterate our universe and burn up the earth. But I think in a way that's the beauty of it. It's that Camus thing again. There's beauty in the futility itself. And so the film and photography as such, in the sense that they are kind of a direct sort of embalming of a moment in time or of a period of time, they reflect in a sort of pure way that impulse to grapple with death and finding joy in the futility of that impulse.
Yeah, finitude makes things meaningful.
Right.
I've been, I guess, binge watching Westworld too much, and identity based in mortality is the only thing that gives meaning to what we do. So even though these, I hope, will go after us, I do see a warning in yours, though, an alarm. This is a period to pay attention to and act, where I kind of sit back in Candide's garden and say it's all for the best and the best of all possible.
Yeah.
Even the queen shits. And that these are common things accessible to anybody, but if there is a divergence, it's in that insistence in yours. This is a trouble point.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, because I think mine is both. It's both the sense that you must tend your own garden and find joy in the futility and the chaos of life. And also that in doing that, you can find some sense of self that spurs you to pay attention and maybe act in the world. And actually, that was the case for Voltaire.
Mm-hmm.
So Candide was a character, but the real Voltaire, the author of Candide, he did that. He was not able to get back into France because he was a dissident. He criticized the church and the state and the culture. And so he bought a house and started a literal garden and tended his garden. And after several years of doing this and finding his sense of self, he was spurred to become an activist, and he was involved in several court cases and defending people against defamation and challenging the state to create a welfare system to ameliorate poverty and all kinds of things. So I think it's a both and rather than an either or. And then you can be at one place or another at different points in time. Tending your garden and just doing that, or coming from a place of doing that and going out into the world is also, which is, you know, like what you were talking about, being in your little painter's hut.
Yeah.
And then discovering photography and suddenly going out and engaging with the world outside. So in a way, you followed that progression.
I did. Yeah.
Great.
Everyone seen the work? Had a chance to tour Allen's film?
See the photos.
Or does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask our two artists here before they
Vanish.
vanish?
The back of their Sisyphean tasks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Navigating the hellscape.
One thing I was thinking of that your discussion brought up that I hadn't really thought of is, you know, when in general, like an artist or a museum wants somebody to stand in front of their work for at least a minimum amount of time instead of just passing by. And so, of course, it's entirely the viewer's choice. So like with your still images, Tim, I mean, you can stand in front of each one however long you want and move along, and you know what Allen's done is he's giving you a moving image, but like you said, you haven't moved the camera. So you've sort of programmed a length you want someone to absorb, like the leaf in the river, and again, you can't control that somebody's going to sit there and watch that, but it's kind of interesting just to think about how you control the view or the viewer.
Yeah, there's definitely an implication in film that the duration in which you absorb it will be directly correlated to the length of the piece itself, in terms of the length in which the images come around and repeat. In a strange way, it's also it's designed so that you can enter into and leave almost at any point. And you might have a different experience each time if you were to see it more than once. But it is very different in terms of the viewer's relationship to it than a static art, where there is no implied time frame whatsoever in terms of how long you're going to sit with the piece.
Though there is a deliberate sequence in here. We do curate and mark a progression, even in a smaller room, of bringing the viewer from, as we read, left to right. And that's why I began with that very full blue and sort of an idyllic scene again. But the punctuation mark at the end is that thunderhead. So I guess I absorbed some of Allen's note of alarm as well, that it's not all orchards and skirts. There's something on the horizon.
Right. And that goes back to that point, too, that in fact editing exists in other art forms beyond cinema, including photography. When you have a series of images, there is a juxtaposition and a progression in it. And I think that's another way that these two pieces are kind of in dialogue.
I've mentioned also wanting to subvert the idea that blue is a melancholic color. I find it very joyful. And I pulled a quote that I hope you had a chance to see from Maggie Nelson, a poet and critic, who writes about blue being formed in void and fire. That these elements that we see in Allen's, I hope I carried over into there in an attempt to give you a different perspective of blue. And that was deliberate as well. I was going to do black and whites initially to be more consistent with Allen's, and then for some reason just thought color, and that color.
Yeah.
Because I've been reading insistently about blue and wanted to bring that in.
It's interesting after seeing Tim's photos in succession there, and then looking at my own work, I suddenly, even though it's black and white, I started to see blue in it. There's all the images of the clouds and the water and the sky.
After.
All these moments, yeah. So it was kind of a after image parallel, if you will.
Cool.
It came to me.
Question?
How is your brand new, like, current work different from these things that we're seeing here?
In this room, I used to hypermediate images. I wanted to be filmic. I really envied film and its qualities, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't do the chemistry or any of it. So I would mimic film. And 5 years ago or so, thematic came along, and Instagram, and anybody could push a button. And there was something filmic. I also had a discussion with Nancy Rexroth. She's the founder of the plastic camera movement in the 70s. Does these beautiful 4x4 images that can stand up to a Robert Polidori that's as big as a wall. And she became hooked on thematic tintypes. So all her work is outside of the film realm now, and she's pressing a button and it looks like a collodion plate. Well, I try to take digital on its own terms with the lens flare, the blown pixels, the artifacts. I try to find the imperfections within that perfection, if that makes sense.
Well, like, so what have you been shooting within the last month? And how is that new, like, what is your newest work saying now, and how is it different from what we're seeing here?
I have a really lousy point and shoot. I've got a 10-year-old DSLR, a kit of vintage lenses that are, some are broken, some are clouded. One of these images was shot through a Ziploc bag, another through sunglasses. I used the polarizers in windshields. Whatever I can do to get away from the fact that this is a fancy camera, or whopping megapixels. I want to go for the artifacts that make it imperfect.
All right. Yeah,
In a similar way to Super 8, maybe.
Super 8, yeah. One of the reasons, I shoot digital video as well, and some of my newer pieces have juxtaposed high definition digital video with Super 8 and Lomo Kino and 35mm high grain photographs. Because I kind of think of them all like a painter's palette. And so I have all of these things on hand, and at any moment I might choose to capture, and it's very intuitive. I might choose to use one color, or I might choose Super 8, or I might choose HD video for this moment, and then bring them all together into a final piece. But what I like specifically about things like Super 8 or 35mm Lomo Kino cinema film, or 16mm for that matter, is that inherent imperfection in the chemistry that you get. And I think it's an interesting contrast sometimes to place that against high definition in a series of images, because they both read as what they are, and they speak to this kind of human, almost this human desire for perfection and the human reality of imperfection.
So what's next for both of you? Like, what do you have coming up?
I'm never without a camera, and I don't work sequentially or in deliberate series. I just kind of grab things as they hit me. And it may be boastful, but I think I work like a poet does. If something, my breakfast, the lawn, this can.
Any shows coming up?
No, I'm still trying to crank out my second book, and stuck forever in this nightmare of putting out the second book. It's sequenced, but it's not, it doesn't have form yet, so I'm waiting to finish that. I'm backing off from most public shows right now to see what comes out of this period. It was a tough winter. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I'm maybe going in the opposite direction at the moment. I've got, in July, I'm going to be studying with Robert Shaler at the Handmade Film Institute on Orcas Island, learning how to make my own film chemistry and do handmade film developing and alternative processes. And then in September, I'll be artist in residence at the North Dakota Museum of Art. And next year, I'll be having a solo exhibition at the Duluth Art Institute. And there'll be a couple new pieces in that. There'll be a video piece and a Super 8 piece, and then a few older pieces that people may have not seen, probably haven't seen. And I've got a documentary called Desolation Slow, which I just finished, and it's going to be released on DVD by Chicago-based 1980 Records, and hopefully I'll do some sort of film tour with it. Possibly, I'm talking to some folks in New York about maybe a premiere somewhere there. And I'm the same boat. I'm always shooting, always filming. I have this kind of ongoing archive of things that I'm drawing from. So that will continue regardless.
Nice. Desolation is slow.
Desolation is slow. Stay tuned.
Cool.
Anybody else?
I just had a question about the actual show. It seemed like to me you were saying that you had seen Allen's film and then kind of curated your selection of photographs kind of in response to, in dialogue with. So Allen, was your work already up and Tim saw it here, or did you two kind of already, I don't know, just like exchange the work and try to work on it together to present here?
We didn't coordinate more than socially. I'd seen a short excerpt on Vimeo of the piece here, and then it was in place before I plotted out what I was going to do.
Okay.
Yeah, we've kind of just gabbed about touchstones and things that might be consonant, but I think I surprised him when I finally put up what I did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was very resonant with the installation.
And it would have been less if it were two people trying to have the same voice. I hope it reads as two different voices following the same terrain.
Mm-hmm.
Any final questions?
Actually, I do, and it applies to both of you. In both cases, I'm going to ask a question individually, but in both cases, you've described your product very, very virtually and empathetically as compared to your process of acquiring imagery.
Mm.
You both talk in one way or another about how deliberate you are about making comparisons, or how deliberate you are about making sure that the camera's still while the action happens in front of the camera. Yet, in both cases, you also described acquiring your imagery as like very happenstantial. What is the relationship between your image making and your product in both cases?
Well, I think for myself, it's very dialectical in a way. There's a tension there between deliberation and what happens spontaneously. So, for example, if I have a camera and it's a tool and I'm in a space where something is calling for me to capture it, that part seems to happen very intuitively. I haven't thought about it ahead of time and said, oh, I'm going to go out and capture A, B, C, D, E. I'm just in a space. I have the thing, and an image presents itself. But something happens in that moment, as the image is presented itself, that these other pieces come to me. So I think about, will the camera be still or will it move with the image? And how will I frame it? 'Cause it's not even so much about what is captured as it is about from where it is captured. The angle or the moment, the placing of the camera in relationship to the depth of field and the focus. So I don't know if that entirely answers it, but it's kind of, there's a tension between those two, and they seem to meet in the moment.
Yeah, in a like way, everything happens in post. I mean, I sit over a slew of images and let's see what I got. And turning to my first book was a real gift that I would start thinking of sequencing and how do images relate to each other and what narrative can you construct, however oblique, after the fact, rather than just, throwing images on a wall. So the process is intuitive of capture, but editing is just as important to me. What I do with an image afterwards, how it relates to what I've done before, and what place that might have in a future body of work. Say the second book or the next show. Or
Yeah, and so there's some sense in which I've created a kind of set of parameters for myself, and then working within those parameters of how I frame an image, or if I choose to move a camera, is intuitive. So there are these boundaries and borders and parameters that I work within, and in that space there's a certain kind of intuition. Sort of like if a painter has chosen a set of brushes and palette, a certain color palette. They're there, they've set that parameter, but they might draw from them intuitively in that moment.
Are you suggesting that your intuition is already limited within a certain context or a certain point of view, or are you saying your intuition is wide open and anything can happen?
I'm suggesting there are certain limitations I've placed on it. Yeah.
And Tim, in your case, are you suggesting that the imagery you've discovered then start to determine what you're going to end up with?
more the opposite. I've limited myself to really lousy gear. So that defines my palette and brush. The things that I have on hand, the best camera is the camera you have with you. It's the old cliche, but yeah, I'm often limited by my lack of knowledge about the medium, about the materials that I'm using to capture. And yeah, I value that happenstance more than proficiency, if that helps. Ed?
My question is twofold. So the first one's a setup for the second. But is there any documentation, like on the internet, you know exactly how many people visited your website or how many people watched this YouTube video, you have all that. Is there any documentation here on how many people go and sit and watch the movie, and how long is the movie and it's in there?
16 minutes.
Okay.
Well, we have visitor lists, and I mean, I don't have the figure.
No, the reason I ask is, I'm wondering, as I, hear the discussion, it's like, will this be on YouTube, or will you be sharing this somewhere else? And the reason I ask is, people are accustomed to watching film a certain way, and when I've gone to the Walker or to museums in New York, it seems like there's these things happening, like playing, and nobody's sitting in there, frequently. And whereas people are engaging the art all the time. At least I feel like whenever somebody goes to an art gallery, that's what they're doing. I do. But is there a better way for art film to be shared? I know that when I was in college, there were art film things where we'd go and there'd be 150 people crammed in a room to watch a film. I'm just asking this, how does it feel to not have a big audience?
I'm perfectly okay with that because this piece specifically was designed for this kind of space. And so I don't think it would read the same if it were online, because you wouldn't be, especially if you're at your house and there are all kinds of distractions. Whereas if you're in this space, you're there and you can, if you choose to, you can take it in as it is intended to be with very little distraction.
I also think it was quantified that the average person spends less than 20 seconds looking at a piece of visual art. And part of my in and out of context show, I don't know if it was the back or the foreground of my mind, but I wanted to slow down that process. You have to stand there and read. So it engaged you in a different way than just a static image would. So I'm frustrated with those limitations as well.
Yeah.
Alan, you've talked about, I think the other piece of Ed's question, where we would rent out the cinema and do showings, and you're also doing something that's not just showing art films in the gallery by creating Solvency Cinema, which I think maybe that's the other aspect of his question.
Yeah, I curate a thing called Solvency Cinema, which is taking avant-garde film and showing a bunch of short films together in an actual movie theater space. Or sometimes it's not a movie theater space, it's a concert venue or a bar. Or it could be a bar, it could be anywhere, but it's a different space than a gallery usually. So that is another context for viewing this kind of thing. And I think it can work in that context as well. And then it becomes more of a communal experience. So I think it's just a different thing, whereas this is more of a solitary experience, and it's kind of intended to be that, as it will read a certain way in this context.
I would say as somebody working in the gallery, so that when people come in, when it isn't a screening or an event, like an opening or an artist talk like this, where many people at that time will spend a lot of time with the work. But I would say that when people come in, they do actually spend about as much time with these two installations as they do with the paintings and the larger show. So, and some people come in and they spend 20 seconds with each thing, and then some people come in and they walk and something strikes them and they stay there for a while, and the same thing with these two rooms. So, I don't know, I think we've had actually pretty good viewership for people who come into the gallery.
Seems like it. Sometimes you almost forget somebody's here.
That there's somebody in that room. It's
yeah.
There's somebody there because it's got the curtains, so you maybe forgot they were in there. So
Too many to count.
yeah. So, but I know what you're saying. Sometimes it does feel. I think that's true in any gallery or museum space. Sometimes the art is, there's these periods where it's very lonely and nobody's in there looking at it, but it's here waiting for them when they're ready. So.